So moving along then, in Kant's critique of pure reason, and continuing with the analytic of principles. Last time we looked at the schematism and how the various schemata related the concepts of the understanding to any possible object. Here what Kant will be concerned with is a kind of archaeology of the ground rules, or an anatomy is a better term, of the ground rules by means of which these are the axioms and the postulates that science assumes in advance prior to constructing its world, namely a world spread out in space and time, governed by the law of causality, and primarily this is the world of waking consciousness, what in the Upanishads is called the world of gross matter, sthula, where the forms change forms slowly and are subject to the law of causality. And the entire world picture here constructed, Gebser's mental consciousness structure, Heidegger's age of the world picture, Cartesian phase space, McLuhan's rationally connected visual space of the Gutenberg galaxy. Those are all various different ways of approach. Rudolf Steiner's age of the intellectual soul. These are all different words for the same thing, namely the metaphysical age of the West, whereby the West uses these metaphysical a priori presuppositions of science to construct a world that excludes any of the other consciousness structures, the realm of dream and myth, and what the Hindus call sukshma, or subtle matter, which is self-luminous, and changes form rapidly, like the forms of myth and dream. That world is hitherto excluded from this world picture, and Kant is now proceeding to analyze what the rules of the game are, what the a priori rules of the game that are assumed prior to the construction of the world picture are that make that world picture possible in the first place. So, what he first decides to do is to talk about the highest principle of all analytic judgments. Analytic judgments, we've seen, are those in which the predicate is simply analyzed out of the subject. Their highest principle is simply the principle of contradiction, which is to say that a thing cannot be both A and not A at the same time. A man cannot be both old and young at the same time, but can certainly be so in succession, although, of course, even that is not true. With, as Deepak Chopra pointed out back when he was a decent philosopher, a decent New Age philosopher, when he pointed out that there were different kinds of aging: chronological age, biological age, psychological age. A man can be chronologically 50 and yet look biologically 40, and psychologically feel like a 30-year-old. So that is possible. That's a different set of criteria, though, than what Kant is talking about here, of course. And then he moves on to say, so that's the highest principle of analytic judgments. The highest principle of synthetic judgments, then, is the possibility of experience. That is to say, insofar as a possible object can have synthetic unity of the manifold by the imagination and intuition conferred upon it and given necessary, given objective status as an objective fact, an objective statement. And so he's going to move on, and what makes that possible, that highest principle, namely the possibility of experience possible, are the ground rules of science. And now he's going to go back to the table of the categories. First, we recall that he started with the table of the judgments, in which we have 4 different categories of logical judgments, but that their root are the pure concepts of the understanding that make those kinds of logical judgments possible: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. He's gone back to that now for his postulates and axioms for the rules. And for quantity, we have then axioms of intuition, and for quality, we have anticipations of perception. They will have their guiding heuristic principles. Then we have analogies of experience for relation, and finally, for modality, we have postulates of empirical thought in general. Now, Kant points out and says, basically, if we have the table in mind, we can cut it in half, because the categories that have to do with quantity and quality, the axioms of intuition and the anticipations of perception, are mathematical, and they have a kind of intuitive certainty about them, that the other 2 categories of relation and modality have only a discursive certainty. That is to say, they're more abstract, and they have to do with the necessary relations between objects, whereas the first 2, quantity and quality, have to do with the construction of an object. The other half, the discursive, or what he calls the dynamic categories of relation and modality, here the analogies of experience and the postulates of empirical thought in general, have a discursive certainty about them, and they are dynamical. That is to say, we have the difference here between mathematics and physics, basically, cutting the chart in half. and two different types of combination. A combination that is simply the synthesis of the manifold, the imagination's synthesis of the manifold that produces its particular objects through the synthesis of apprehension and intuition, and also reproduction. And then we have the other half of that, which is the dynamical world of the laws of causality, in which objects have necessary relationships to each other and possible or actual or necessary relationships to the intellect. So we have two halves, and that other half is called the principle of Nexus. The first half is called the principle of combination. Just two different ways of connecting things. But this is how science constructs its world picture of any possible object, that is to say object X. Not, be it said, the transcendental object X, which is out there somewhere behind all this, and we don't know what that is. It's a mystery. This is object X insofar as it is any possible object for empirical and universal objective knowledge of the science. And then so the first of the axioms of intuition, the axioms of intuition and the anticipations of perception each have one guiding rule, whereas the others have three each. And so for this video, I just want to look at the single guiding rules for the axioms of intuition and the anticipations of perception. The axioms of intuition, then, which is the category of quantity, their principle is that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes. And then Kant's proof for this is that basically they have to be assumed to be extensive magnitudes because the way geometry works, and this quantity mainly has to do with mathematics, with geometry and arithmetic, is that the way that the imagination proceeds in its synthesis is that it moves from the construction of parts to a whole. And it's not possible unless it's assumed that this is an extensive magnitude that's being constructed in space. And it can't be, as in Plato, that these geometrical objects have an ontological reality unto themselves, as though they were reified as things in themselves, as Plato does reify them. And in that case, then they're no longer objects of a possible experience for Kant. So they have to stay within the bounds of space. And so it has to be assumed that they have extensive magnitude. They're extensive. When I come up with a figure through the synthesis of imagination, if I think of a line, the extensive magnitude has to guide it along as the production from part to part to part of the whole that gives it its wholeness and allows me to assume that anything that I construct in such fashion through that particular kind of synthesis has a wholeness about it that involves extension. If I don't assume that, then I'm left either with geometrical figures that are things in themselves, or I can't assume that they have a universal and necessary validity to them. So that has to be their basic assumption. So that's his proof that he gives for the axioms of intuition, that it's assumed that all intuitions have extensive magnitudes. Now with regard to the other one, the category of quality, and its anticipations of perception, its guiding rule is that in all appearances, the real that is an object of sensation has intensive magnitude. That is to say, a degree. Now the way then that, so this is degree of sensation as opposed to extension of the object in space. This is degree of sensation. And Kant says here in his proof that it has to be assumed that objects have a degree of sensation in the real that moves from zero all the way up to an infinity of sensations that can go up to a magnitude that's entirely independent from the extensive magnitude of the object. You can have an object that is extended in space, but that weighs less and less and less and less and less, and you can imagine that in your mind weighing less and less and less as that quality of weight disappears infinitely. So the type of synthesis that the imagination proceeds to, in this case, does not move, as it does in the axioms of intuition, from parts to the whole, but is simultaneous. It's instantaneous, rather. You perceive the sensation of heat or color instantly, so it doesn't proceed successively. It's instant, and it has this magnitude of degree moving up from a scale from 0 to on up to infinity. And so Kant proves this idea of that any object that we encounter, any possible object, has to have some kind of degree of sensation about it. And so notice that, just as it was said of Newton that he stood on the shoulders of giants by building into his worldview the achievements, more narrow achievements of Galileo and Kepler and so forth, Kant builds into his worldview the previous achievements of the previous philosophers, because basically what he's talking about here are what Locke and Galileo had distinguished between primary and secondary qualities. That is to say, it was thought that primary qualities, which he's calling here basically quantity. Primary qualities were objective, and they had to do with things like motion, figure, shape, extension, solidity, and rest that were objective and were the proper domain of science, and that you could make objective arguments, objective judgments about objects based on that objectivity of primary qualities, but that the secondary qualities that Kant is calling here quality in general, or sensation, heat, sensation of temperature, sensation of color, those are the secondary qualities. So he's building in those primary and secondary qualities into his system as necessary assumptions that science has to make whenever it constructs its object, its possible object of experience. And that's all Kant is concerned with here in this analytic of principles of the pure understanding as objects of a possible experience denuded of empirical content. That really is it for those two sets of principles. And I want to stop here because the other two sets of principles each have three. For the analogies of experience, there are three principles with the three proofs. And for the postulates of empirical thought, there'll be three more principles and three more proofs. So there'll be a lot more to go through. So I want to save that for another video. So we'll stop there for that.